Once, the name Nick Diaz sent chills through opponents. Stockton's own street soldier that was a symbol of defiance, toughness, and rebellion. But today, at 42, the story is very different. Instead of championships and glory, Diaz battles addiction, depression, cancelled comebacks, and a body broken by years of war. Viral clips show him wandering shirtless in the night, lost in his own city. How did one of MMA's most feared legends end up here? And is there any hope left for the fighter who never truly wanted to fight? Nick Diaz wasn't built in a gym. He was forged in Stockton streets. Born in 1983 in a rough working-class city in California, Nick's childhood was far from easy. Poverty, violence, and chaos surrounded him, and fighting became less of a choice and more of a survival tool. He grew up scrapping in the streets, where toughness mattered more than technique. That raw defiance would later define his career. By his teenage years, Nick discovered jiu-jitsu. Training under Cesar Gracie, he quickly stood out, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he was relentless. Even then, Nick had that signature intensity, endless cardio, unshakable toughness, and an attitude that dared you to break him. For every sparring session, he was the guy who wouldn't stop coming forward, who made even seasoned fighters want to quit. At just 18, Diaz turned pro. By 20, he was in the UFC, and right away, fans knew he wasn't like the others. He wasn't polished. He wasn't marketable in the traditional sense. He cursed in interviews, brawled in cages, and flipped off opponents mid-fight. He didn't play the game. He tore it apart. Against Lawler in 2004, Nick shocked the MMA world by standing toe-to-toe with one of the scariest knockout artists alive. He taunted him, slapped him, and then dropped him with a clean 1-2. That was Nick Diaz, fearless, reckless, brilliant. His style was chaotic but effective, volume punching, iron chin, suffocating cardio, and a ground game that most fighters underestimated until it was too late. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was breaking their will. Every jab, every insult, every Stockton slap chipped away at them, and he thrived in it. But even in the beginning, there were cracks. He hated press conferences, media tours, and the promotional machine. He felt exploited by promoters, misunderstood by fans, and constantly at war with athletic commissions. His talent and toughness should have made him a superstar, but his refusal to play by the rules kept him on the outside looking in. Still, by the mid-2000s, Nick Diaz was a cult hero. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol of defiance. And like all symbols, his rise carried the seeds of his eventual fall. By his mid-20s, Nick Diaz was more than a fighter. He was a movement. Fans adored him not because he was polished or politically correct, but because he was raw, real, and impossible to control. In an era where MMA was polishing itself into a mainstream sport, Diaz was the middle finger sticking out of the glove. He racked up iconic wins in Strikeforce, Pride, and other promotions outside the UFC. Against Takanori Gomi in 2007, Nick delivered one of the greatest fights in MMA history. He absorbed bombs, kept coming forward, and then, in a moment of pure Diaz brilliance, locked in a gogoplata. A submission so rare, it felt like something out of a martial arts myth. It was vintage Diaz. Toughness, technique, and defiance rolled into one. In Strikeforce, he became champion. He fought Paul Daly in one of the wildest one-round wars ever. Daly nearly finished him multiple times, but Nick refused to go down. He stormed back, overwhelming Daly with pressure until the referee had to stop it. The fight was chaos, violence, and drama. Everything fans loved about Diaz in under 5 minutes. But while fans loved him, commissions and promoters didn't. Nick failed drug tests for marijuana over and over again. In a sport rife with steroid scandals, Diaz's sins seemed small, but the commissions came down hard. Suspensions, fines, and constant battles with athletic boards became as much a part of his career as the fights themselves. He also clashed with promoters. He skipped press conferences, no-showed events, and spoke openly about his distrust of the system. He accused the UFC of favoritism, of exploiting fighters, of treating him like a pawn. And while many fighters stayed silent, Diaz said what others were afraid to. That honesty won him fans, but cost him opportunities. By now, Nick Diaz wasn't just a fighter, he was a rebel icon. He represented fighters who felt silenced, fans who wanted authenticity, and the underdogs who fought against everything. But being a symbol came at a cost. It meant Nick was always at war, with the system, with his opponents, and most tragically, with himself. In 2011, Nick Diaz returned to the UFC, and the timing felt perfect. Fans were clamoring for him, the welterweight division was stacked, and Dana White saw the chance to turn the cult hero into a mainstream star. Diaz was booked against UFC legend BJ Penn, and the result was a masterclass in pressure fighting. For 3 rounds, Nick battered Penn with relentless volume, taunting him, breaking him down, and earning a dominant win. For the first time, Nick Diaz was undeniably a top contender. His performances earned him a shot at Georges St-Pierre, the welterweight king. The build-up was classic Diaz, confrontations at pressers, trash talk, and a refusal to play the UFC's game. The fight itself showed the gap between Diaz and the very elite. GSP out-wrestled him, controlled him, and neutralized his weapons. Diaz was tough, but he was outclassed. Still, his status as a star only grew. Then, clashing in a surreal moment, Nick came out clowning Silva, laying on the mat, mocking him, slapping him, classic Stockton energy. He lost on the scorecards, but the fight cemented his place as one of MMA's most unforgettable personalities. Yet behind the fame, Diaz's demons were catching up. He was constantly battling suspensions for marijuana. After the Silva fight, he tested positive again, his 3rd offense. This time, the Nevada State Athletic Commission came down with a shocking punishment: a 5-year suspension for smoking weed. That suspension broke him. It wasn't just about losing fights. Fighting was Nick's identity, his purpose, his therapy. Without it, he spiraled. Depression, substance use, and isolation followed. The cult hero who once defied the system was now trapped by it. By his early 30s, Diaz's career was in limbo. He wasn't retired, but he wasn't fighting. He wasn't suspended forever, but he wasn't coming back. Years slipped away, and with them, the sharpness that had once made him great. For fans, it was heartbreaking. Nick Diaz had gone from Stockton's toughest kid to a UFC superstar, only to watch his career collapse not from knockouts, but from bureaucracy, drugs, and demons. For most fighters, time away from the cage is healing. For Nick Diaz, it was torture. After the Nevada State Athletic Commission handed him a 5-year suspension for marijuana in 2015, his career effectively hit a wall. Even Dana White called the penalty insane, but it stuck long enough to steal Nick's prime fighting years. Nick wasn't like other athletes who could pivot to business ventures, commentary, or coaching. Fighting wasn't just a job to him, it was his entire identity. Without it, he drifted. For nearly 6 years, Nick lived in limbo. He trained sporadically, surfed in Stockton, partied, and disappeared from the spotlight, only to reappear in erratic interviews or viral street encounters. Fans who idolized him during his Strikeforce and early UFC days started seeing a different side. Reports surfaced of Diaz drinking heavily, wandering the Las Vegas Strip at night, or getting into street altercations. Clips went viral of him looking dazed, rambling in interviews, or surrounded by crowds as if he were a ghost of the fighter he once was. Behind the scenes, Nick's friends and training partners admitted he was battling depression, the same qualities that made him great in the cage. Intensity, obsession, defiance became destructive outside of it. Without the structure of training camps and fights, that energy turned inward. He was restless, reckless, and adrift. By 2018, whispers of a comeback began to swirl, but every time, something stalled it. Legal trouble, mental health struggles, a lack of commitment. Years piled on, and the legend of Nick Diaz became less about what he was doing and more about what he wasn't. Fans clung to hope. They remembered the warrior who battered Robbie Lawler, who clowned Anderson Silva, who fought GSP on the biggest stage. They wanted him back, but deep down, many knew the truth. Nick Diaz's time was gone, and every year away made the return less likely. When the UFC announced Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler 2 in 2021, fans erupted. 17 years after their first fight, which Diaz had won in spectacular fashion, the rematch felt like destiny. For nostalgic fans, it was a chance to see their cult hero one last time. For Nick, it was supposed to be a comeback story. But from the moment fight week began, something felt off. Nick looked different, slower, heavier, older. His interviews were disjointed, his demeanor more detached than defiant. He admitted openly that he didn't even want to fight, that he felt pressured into returning. It was not the Nick Diaz who thrived on chaos. It was a man going through the motions. When the fight started, flashes of the old Nick appeared. He peppered Lawler with volume punching, his signature combinations still there in bursts. The Stockton slap even made an appearance. For a moment, it felt like 2004 again. But reality quickly set in. Nick's timing was off. His cardio, once his greatest weapon, betrayed him. The endless pressure that once broke opponents now broke him. By the third round, Lawler landed a clean shot that dropped Nick. He stayed on the canvas, covering up, shaking his head. For the first time in his career, Nick Diaz quit. The referee waved it off, and just like that, the comeback ended in tragedy. Fans were torn. Some applauded his bravery for even stepping back into the octagon after 6 years away. Others saw it as proof that the legend was gone. The warrior who once terrified Robbie Lawler with a grin and relentless volume was now a shadow of himself, crumbling under the weight of time and absence. But perhaps the saddest part was Nick's own words. In post-fight interviews, he admitted he never wanted the fight, that he didn't understand why it happened, that he was pushed into it. It was a devastating confession. Not only had Nick Diaz lost, but it seemed like he never even wanted to be there in the first place. After the Lawler rematch, Nick Diaz's future became a question mark. Would he fight again? Did he even want to? Months turned into years, and while rumors of a return continued to swirl, Nick himself looked more and more like a man trapped between the past and present. Public sightings painted a grim picture. Viral videos showed him wandering shirtless through Las Vegas streets, often late at night, looking lost or disoriented. Others captured him at parties, drinking, sometimes surrounded by strangers who cheered at the sight of him but rarely offered real support. To fans, these clips were heartbreaking. The man who once dominated the world's toughest fighters now seemed like he couldn't dominate his own demons. Physically, the damage was evident. Decades of wars inside the cage had left him scarred, slower, and visibly aged beyond his years. The once endless gas tank was gone. His speech seemed slurred at times, his interviews more scattered. Whispers of CTE, brain trauma, and the long-term consequences of fighting followed him wherever he went. Emotionally, Nick's own words told the story. He admitted to feeling trapped, never truly loving fighting but needing it to survive. He spoke of depression, of hating the spotlight, of the pressures that came with being Nick Diaz. Unlike his younger brother Nate, who embraced the spotlight and built a massive fan following, Nick seemed stuck, unable to walk away, but unwilling to dive back in fully. The tragedy of Nick Diaz isn't just that he declined, it's that he declined while still being adored. Fans chant his name, beg for his return, and celebrate his legacy. But Nick himself seems disconnected from it all, almost as if he never wanted to be the legend they made him. At 42 years old, Nick Diaz is not the fighter he once was, and perhaps never will be again. His story now is not one of comeback glory, but of survival. Every appearance, every viral clip, every rumor of a fight feels like a reminder of what was lost and what fighting truly takes from those who give it everything. After the Lawler fight, Nick Diaz largely faded from the spotlight. The man who once terrified champions and flipped off cameras now lives in fragments. Glimpses of him caught on shaky phone videos, grainy Instagram lives, or TMZ clips. To fans who grew up idolizing his grit and authenticity, these sightings don't inspire nostalgia. They inspire concern. Nick is often seen shirtless in public, wandering the streets of Las Vegas at odd hours, rambling incoherently or shadowboxing in the dark. At parties, he's surrounded by crowds, but rarely by friends who truly seem to care for him. To strangers, he's still Nick Diaz, the legend. But to those who look closer, it feels like watching a man drowning while people cheer from the shore. His relationship with MMA is fractured. He talks about returning, about needing money, about wanting to prove himself, but his actions tell another story. Training camps are inconsistent. His body is slower, heavier, worn down from decades of combat. Even his brother Nate, still an active fighter, seems unsure what Nick truly wants. The brotherhood that defined their careers remains strong, but even Nate admits Nick's heart was never fully in fighting. Worse, Nick himself admits it. In interviews, he's said plainly, "I never really enjoyed fighting." Those words cut deep. For fans, fighting was his gift, his legacy, his immortality. But for Nick Diaz, it was obligation, pressure, and pain. At 42, with his prime long behind him, the only thing left tying him to fighting is the memory of who he once was. Financially, Nick has struggled too. Unlike today's stars who can build brands and monetize fan bases, Nick fought in an era before big payday. He headlined massive fights, but his purse rarely reflected his star power. Combined with suspensions, legal battles, and time away, he never built the wealth his name deserved. That reality adds to the tragedy. The legend who bled for the sport now drifts in its aftermath with little to show for it. For decades, Nick Diaz built his reputation on toughness. The ability to take punishment, to keep walking forward no matter what, was his greatest weapon. But at 42, that weapon has become his curse. Years of brawls left scars that can't be hidden. His face is etched with damage, his nose flattened, his eyes heavy with scar tissue. His once endless cardio is gone, his body slower, stiffer. But the physical toll is only part of the story. The mental toll may be worse. Nick's interviews often ramble, jumping from thought to thought. Fans notice the slurred speech, the confusion, the flashes of paranoia. These are the hallmarks of CTE, the brain damage that has haunted fighters, football players, and boxers for decades. Nick has never openly confirmed it, but his symptoms are hard to ignore. Then there's the depression. Nick has admitted to feeling lost, to never wanting the spotlight, to being crushed by the expectations of fans and promoters. He's confessed to hating the very thing that made him famous, fighting. For years, he numbed it with marijuana, alcohol, and partying. But as time passes, those escapes seem less like lifestyle choices and more like survival mechanisms. And yet, the tragedy isn't just that Nick Diaz is broken. It's that he fought so hard to prove he couldn't be broken. Every Stockton slap, every taunt, every war in the cage was Nick screaming at the world, "I can take it, I won't fall." But now, outside the cage, he is falling. And unlike in MMA, there are no referees to save him, no judges to score his performance, no crowd to lift him back up. Nick Diaz gave everything to the fight game, his body, his mind, his identity. And at 42, the cost has come due. When the history of MMA is written, Nick Diaz will never be forgotten. Not because of titles, he never held UFC gold. Not because of perfect records, he lost often, sometimes badly, but because he represented something no one else could: authenticity. In a sport full of hype and marketing, Nick Diaz was raw. He never played the game. He cursed in pressers, skipped interviews, and spoke the unvarnished truth about fighter pay, favoritism, and the ugly side of the business. Fighters who came after him, including his brother Nate, carried that torch. The entire Diaz army, a generation of fans who loved rebellion more than perfection, was built on Nick's shoulders. In the cage, he was chaos incarnate. His style, relentless pressure, iron chin, endless volume, wasn't just effective, it was inspiring. He broke fighters not with one punch, but with 1,000. He taunted legends, slapped champions, and made opponents quit in ways that haunted them forever. Robbie Lawler, Takanori Gomi, Paul Daly, all of them left the cage knowing Nick Diaz wasn't like anyone else. And outside the cage, he was a symbol. A kid from Stockton who rose from nothing to become one of the most beloved anti-heroes in MMA. Fans still chant his name. They still wear his shirts. They still beg for his return. Because Nick Diaz wasn't just a fighter, he was a feeling, defiance, rawness, survival. But legacies are complicated. At 42, Nick's life is tragic. His health is fading, his purpose unclear, his future uncertain. To some, that diminishes his story. But to others, it makes it even more powerful. Because Nick Diaz's life, like his fights, was never about perfection. It was about struggle, pain, defiance. And maybe that's why fans will always love him. Because Nick Diaz, even broken and battered, never stopped being Nick Diaz. A fighter who never wanted to fight, but fought anyway. Against opponents, against against promoters, against himself. The story of Nick Diaz isn't over, but wherever it goes, one truth remains. Legends aren't always crowned with belts. Sometimes they're carved out of tragedy. And Nick Diaz, at 42, is the tragic legend MMA will never forget.